So, the one thing in life we can inevitably count on is change, and today's article is a great example of that. It's titled 15 Weird Rules from the 60s That Make Zero Sense Today. The 1960s were full of very questionable rules, and looking back, it's kinda crazy how normal some things were back then. Luckily, times have changed, and a lot of those outdated rules no longer exist. Here are some of the weirdest 60s rules that would leave people scratching their heads now. First up, women needed a man's permission to get a credit card. Honestly, it sounds ridiculous, but women couldn't just open a credit card by themselves. Even if a woman worked full-time and paid her own bills, she needed her husband, father, or another male relative to co-sign. The idea was that women weren't responsible enough to manage money on their own. Up next, wearing pants was banned in a lot of places for women. You know, it's hard to even imagine this being real now, but back in the 60s, women wearing pants was considered so inappropriate that some schools, restaurants, and even workplaces banned it outright. Today, most people wouldn't think twice about someone wearing jeans or slacks anywhere. It's wild how something as basic as clothing used to be so tightly controlled. Up next, schools could legally spank students. In the 1960s, corporal punishment was completely normal. Teachers could paddle students for misbehaving, and parents were usually fine with it. There wasn't much regulation on how hard or how often either. Nowadays, the idea of a teacher hitting a kid would lead to lawsuits, media coverage, and school board meetings. Next up, husbands could control their wives' jobs. There's no denying that this feels like something straight out of a dystopian novel, but it was real life. In many parts of the US, a husband could decide if his wife was allowed to work. If he didn't want her to have a job, she was expected to quit, no questions asked. Women's career goals were treated like hobbies that could be dropped at any moment. Up next, segregation was still legally enforced. Many of us think of segregation as ancient history, but in the 60s, it was still written into law in many parts of the country. Everything was divided by race, with Black Americans facing constant discrimination and worse conditions. Even after major civil rights victories, real change took a long time. Up next, you needed a doctor's permission to buy birth control. At first glance, this rule might sound like it was about safety. However, it was really about control. In the 1960s, even married women needed a doctor's approval and sometimes even their husbands to access birth control. The whole process was built around the idea that women shouldn't control their own reproductive choices without someone else's permission. Up next, divorce was almost impossible to get. The way divorce worked a few decades ago would blow people's minds today. You couldn't just decide you didn't want to be married anymore. You had to prove fault, like cheating or abuse, in court. Judges could even deny your divorce if they didn't think your reasons were good enough. Up next, restaurants could refuse service based on race. We can all agree that hearing this nowadays sounds ridiculous, but it was legal in many places. A restaurant owner could simply refuse to serve someone because of the color of their skin, and there was nothing the customer could do about it. The Civil Rights Act of 1964 helped end legal segregation, but before that, discrimination was baked into everyday life. Up next, women weren't allowed to serve on juries. Did you know that women could be barred from jury duty simply because they were women? The idea was that they were too emotional to make rational decisions in court. Not only was this insanely sexist, but it also meant that juries weren't remotely representative of the public. Up next, airline stewardesses had crazy appearance rules. It probably comes as no surprise that working as a flight attendant in the 60s came with a ridiculous list of requirements. You had to be a certain weight, wear specific makeup, keep your hairstyle just right, and often stay single. If you gained weight, got married, or got older, you could be fired. Up next, drinking and driving wasn't taken seriously. Attitudes towards drinking were far too casual during this period of time. There were way fewer laws and minimal consequences unless there was an accident. It wasn't unusual for people to have a few drinks and get behind the wheel like it was no big deal. Up next, being gay was still illegal. Believe it or not, in many states, being openly gay was literally a crime, and people could be arrested just for who they loved. The Stonewall riots of 1969 were a huge turning point, but the fact that it took massive protests just to demand basic rights is mind-blowing. Up next, interracial marriage was banned in some states. It's crazy to think that marrying someone of a different race could get you arrested in some parts of the US. It wasn't until 1967 that the Supreme Court struck down laws banning interracial marriage in the landmark Loving v. Virginia case. Fast forward to the 21st century, and interracial marriage is completely legal and way more accepted. Next up, married women couldn't get a passport without their husband's approval. How frustrating that if you were a married woman in the 1960s and wanted to travel, it was extremely difficult. In some cases, a husband had to sign off before a woman could get a passport. The idea was that a married woman's identity was tied to her husband's, even when it came to traveling the world. And finally, schools enforced strict dress codes. Lastly, while dress codes still exist today, back then they were next level strict. Girls had to measure skirt lengths, boys had to keep their hair a certain length, and even socks were regulated. The goal was to force students to look neat, but honestly, it was just another way to control personal expression. Alright, there you have it, 15 weird rules from the 60s that make zero sense today. Wow, things have really changed since the 60s, right? Which one of these 15 rules do you think is the wildest back in the day? Put it in the comment section. Let me know what is the craziest rule from this article that you think you're happy has gone away. And as always, if you enjoyed this content, please take a second to give it a like. Go ahead and smash that big thumbs up like button right now. And if you really enjoy the content, consider subscribing to the channel. We got fresh videos coming to you daily, so there's always something new for you to watch. I thank you for watching this one to the very end. I'm Brian Kingsbury. We'll talk to you on the next one. Bye.